What's shaking, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Geoff and Anwar on the Orange Bloods Texas Football Channel. I'm Geoff Ketchum. That is Anwar Richardson. Do us a solid. Like that video. Subscribe to the channel. Do notifications. Leave your comments in the comments section. And if there was ever a topic today that I think warrants comments, that honestly, it feels like we're going to be asking the big rhetorical question of 2022. And it might be that we just won't be able to answer this until we get to October. But Anwar, we're talking Big 12 today. Not Texas leaving the Big 12, just the Big 12. And whether or not we're talking about a conference that going into 2022 is more open than maybe any of us could possibly realize. We've lived in a world where every year it's Oklahoma's championship until someone takes it from them. They didn't even make the championship game a year ago. And today, if you ask me for my thoughts on the Big 12, like I am a big old box of I don't know.
Catch, there's many changes going into the 2022 season. You start with like Oklahoma and Lincoln Riley not being there, some of their key departures, on both sides of the ball, losing two quarterbacks. And what is that going to look like, especially from a defensive-minded coach coming into the Big 12? We've seen people who've had these great defensive ideas, Catch, and I feel like often it's where, defenses come to die. Then you've got Iowa State, Catch. And I mean, they were loaded on both sides of the ball. They didn't get to the Big 12 title game, and they had the process, senior starters on both sides. Those guys are gone. What does Iowa State look like going forward? And then TCU, that no matter what you want to say, TCU was the thorn and has been the thorn in Texas's sides for years. Maybe they don't get up for every other team, but there's no Gary Patterson anymore. And so what does that look like with, the first year coach out from SMU? What does that whole thing look like over there? And so I think if you're a Texas fan, if you wanted to breathe life and breathe hope into the 2022 season, you've got to say, okay, we've got just about all of our parts coming back. There's a lot of other teams that are going to have a lot of moving parts. Listen, it's too early to start pouring the Kool-Aid, Catch, but there is a lot of coin flip as we talk about what this 2022 season is going to look like.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things in my head when we start to talk about who should really be the favorite in the Big 12 going into next season. You and I had a default answer to the question of who is the best head coach in the Big 12 for the last few years. I mean, Lincoln Riley had the rings. He's had the Heisman thing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it felt like everything that he touched turned to gold, and he kind of got that benefit of the doubt in a conversation with us. Yet in 2022, and honestly, this feels like a video we just need to file away for future videos. The ranking of Big 12 coaches going into 2022, I don't want to do that with you. That's going to be a badass video, but I don't want to do that today. I just want to establish in this conversation who's number one, and is anybody a fool if they answer someone other than Mike Gundy?
You can argue Dave Aranda. You can argue what he was able to do in a short time span, being able to turn that program around, from the losses that they had in his first year, which, by the way, Catch, I've said it before, we talked about it. You've got to put an asterisk by that season. That was a COVID season for him. That's a guy getting here in year one, in COVID, not being able to do, the off-season workouts with the team, basically just getting to training camp and kind of starting to try to hit the ground running there. There's a lot of moving parts he needs to put in there. He needs to make a coaching change, and then they come out and have a phenomenal season over there at Baylor. I would definitely make a case for Aranda. You know how I feel about Gundy. I've always have praised Gundy and how he just his program and how he's got it going. And you just know, Catch, year in and year out what to expect from a Mike Gundy team. Like the names may change, but they're going to have a tough running back. Some guy, even from Canada, right? They're going to have a tough running back, above average quarterback, a stud receiver, and then they're going to be solid on defense. So, I think you could go back and forth. If you had me to choose one, I'd probably take Aranda just because of the title and what he was able to do. But it's a close conversation for me.
Well, look, I think Dave Aranda had the single best year of coaching that I've ever seen any Big 12 coach have. And it might very well be that he's the answer 10 years from now. Maybe he's coaching in the NFL and having success, unlike a Matt Rule, and we'll say, oh, or maybe he's like at LSU or something like that. And we'll look back and go, remember 10 years ago when we were having this conversation? And the thing is, Mike Gundy, I kind of give the benefit of the doubt to right now because of what you said, the stability and the names change and his teams always look the same. That's still something that Dave Aranda has to prove. And if Lincoln Riley were still in the conference, Lincoln Riley would still be my answer as to who the best coach in the Big 12 is. But like Dave Aranda is on the marquee. He has an arrow that's green pointing up. It feels like no matter what, though, when we talk about the Big 12, we both are in the agreement that there are two right now that have earned the right to be 1 and 2 in whatever order, Gundy and Aranda. No offense to Campbell at Iowa State. You know what I mean? Like, no offense to anybody else in the conference, because they're good. No offense to Steve Sarkisian. Those two guys have the rings. Those two guys have now proven things that the other coaches haven't. And Gary Patterson has gone also. We've seen this turnover take place. It's interesting when you look at both teams. This is just going to be a weird year because the answer is almost certainly the best two teams and the favorites in the Big 12 should be Oklahoma State and Baylor. They just should be. First of all, it feels like the entire conference is having turnover at quarterback, not just Texas and Oklahoma. Think about Iowa State with Bryce Purdy. Think about Kansas State with Skylar Thompson. All over the conference, we're seeing turnover. Oklahoma State gets Spencer Sanders back for another year.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at Baylor with Jerry Bohannon, and, both of those teams would seem, and, Baylor has the backup quarterback as well that they liked a lot that played late in the season. Those two teams have carryover at the quarterback position, along with the coaching, along with, you think about Baylor, a lot of their front seven returns. I think they lose Terrell Bernard, but I think the rest of their front seven returns. You think about Oklahoma State, that's a team that had a ton of seniors a year ago, but they're good on the offensive line. They returned both of their running backs. Dominic Richardson was a guy that by the end of the year was doing some damage. Like, I think that I'm talking myself into those two teams are the favorites that Texas and Oklahoma have to chase down. And there are elements of both Texas and Oklahoma that frankly have a lot of proving to do before you can definitively say they deserve to be listed ahead of whether it's coaches, whether it's players, regardless. Like those in less than 12 months, it feels like the benchmark in the Big 12 has changed. Whatever the answer is, it sure as hell doesn't feel like Oklahoma right now.
Yeah, I mean, my only cautionary tale when the conversation of OU comes in
from last year,
it just the cautionary tale is this. I remember us having this conversation when Tom Herman was hired and Lincoln Riley gets the nod, later in the year to replace Stoops, and thinking to myself, and out loud, and probably stuff I wrote if I go back and look, man, OU's vulnerable, and I feel like
they're really vulnerable now.
They're vulnerable now. Okay, now granted, there's clearly a Lincoln Riley factor that could not be ignored. But here's I said OU might be vulnerable after Baker Mayfield, right? And then the next thing you know, They get Kyler Murray. And then I'm like, okay, they got to be vulnerable after the Kyler Murray. And then next thing you know, they get Jalen Hurts. And I'm like, all right, they're going to be vulnerable after Jalen Hurts is concerned. And then they get Spencer Rattler rather, who had a good, freshman season. Not outstanding, but good enough. And then I think to myself, oh man, they benching Spencer. Look at what Texas is doing against OU. Man, they're curb stomping these boys. And then next thing you know, OU comes back and wins with Caleb Williams. So now I feel like once again, Ketch, it's like Groundhog's Day for me. Now I'm like, Brent Venables, like who's going to be the starting quarterback? What? Oh, they've lost a lot of key components, and I'm like, I don't know. I see it, but I feel like I've said it too many times. Where
they finished third in the conference last year.
I get it.
And 100%. Now they're vulnerable. And I'll say this. Oklahoma has never been this vulnerable.
Yes.
Oh, I mean, the departures all over everybody will talk about quarterback, but they had a mass exodus both to the NFL and it's a completely different team. Mm-hmm. Now, the cupboard's not empty and they got good coaches, but they don't have an identity anymore. They do not.
Sure.
That is the thing that they've lost more than Caleb Williams, because Joe Schmo you and I could show up and be quarterback. And as long as Lincoln Riley is there, I'm like, it's the wolf in Pulp Fiction. It's like, oh, Lincoln Riley's on it. All right, cool. Mm-hmm. It's going to be fine. They don't have that anymore. And so I don't even know what and where to give the benefit of the doubt to Oklahoma, because that's where I think their vulnerability really exists. It's not a thing. It's not a turnover at just one position. They got to figure. It's like Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, and when they put him back together again, he's an animal, or it's a completely different thing. And it feels like there's a Texas OU conversation to have that, again, is probably another video. But do we both think, okay, who do you think do you have a team in your mind that's a favorite? If you had to pick one, I want to take us somewhere, so trust me on this. Do you have a favorite?
Baylor would be my favorite going into the season. So
Baylor at the time is the favorite. And
yes,
could be completely deserved. Although, they'll be in it. We're going to find out how good Dave Aranda is at doing what Mike Gundy does.
Absolutely.
Which is be good every year.
Year in and year out. Correct.
What do you think there's a second place team? Is it Oklahoma State, or is it Oklahoma? And us talking about Oklahoma's vulnerability.
Yeah.
In the back of your mind, are you thinking they deserve to be two?
No. I'm going to go Gundy because I know what I'm going to get out of Gundy, right? Yeah. I know exactly what I'm going to get out of Gundy, and I know if things fall in the right direction, what he can do. But I don't go into Bedlam anymore thinking, man, you ain't got a shot. Like this is you're there to take that L. Like I go into it and go, okay, no. Like, Oklahoma State probably has the upper hand.
Which leaves us this $1 million question of who deserves. I mean, in a preseason poll, I think we're right. Like, I think Baylor and Oklahoma State are going to be the prohibitive favorites. The loser of Texas and Oklahoma, not the game this year, just that conversation, is fourth in the Big 12. Mm-hmm. In a Big 12 with 10 teams, you're not much further away from being to the back end of the list than the front end of the list. And I think it's a damning thing. I think this year felt like chaos. And it felt like here comes Oklahoma State and Baylor, kind of Johnny-come-latelys. Oklahoma, even until the end, even until Bedlam, Oklahoma had a chance to be that team. The loser of Oklahoma, Texas this year being fourth, that just sounds bad. If you're Oklahoma and you finish fourth, it feels like you have taken a step back from what Lincoln Riley had you in. Rather than being on the cusp of the Big 12 championship game, you finish behind 3 teams. And if you're Texas, you can point to Oklahoma State and Baylor right now and say they're better. They're the defending, they played a major bowl games. They did their thing. But in year 2 of Sark, you can't finish behind those 2 teams and Oklahoma to finish fourth at best. So the Big 12 has changed in the way that we're going to talk about this offseason, because last year it was Oklahoma and Iowa State 1-2, which neither plays in the Big 12 championship game. But the idea was that Texas was third, and could they knock on the door and knock one of those 2 teams out and get in? Mm-hmm. It's a lot more crowded now at the top. That Texas doesn't just have to climb over 2 teams. They've got to climb over 2 teams with a lot of good returning players, and Oklahoma, who they've not yet slayed that dragon. They haven't A, beaten them, and they haven't B, finished ahead of them in a long time. And it is the thing that shapes the narrative of this entire season. I guess 2 things. A, can you play well enough to convince Arch Manning to come to Texas? Mm-hmm. I don't know what that record is. And maybe 8-4 could do it. But what does a 4th place finish leave Steve Sarkisian potentially? I don't think it's a good place. Like, I think that at the end of the year, there's got to be a 3-team conversation about the Big 12, or even a 4-team conversation. But Texas can't be 4th or worse, which is what they've been obviously last season when they finished 5-7.
Catch this was, I wanted to ask you something.
Yeah.
Is this almost similar to where we were a couple of years ago with Sam Ehlinger's senior season? And we were saying to ourselves, okay, look, Sam Ehlinger is a senior, OU, they're going to have a freshman quarterback. If there ever was a year for Texas to do it, you've got to be able to pull it off this year. Are we in that territory? Or are we close?
I don't think so.
No, are we? So, but we're talking about teams that there's a lot of teams that once we get past the Baylor and the Oklahoma States of the world, everybody's got question marks, right?
Yeah, but Baylor and Oklahoma State are now the Oklahoma of previous years, and there's 2 of them. And sure. For so long, Texas has looked past everybody in the Big 12, and they just have said to themselves, God, we got to beat Oklahoma, and we might have to beat them twice. But everybody wrongly just looks at Mike Gundy and waves their hand. They won't be. And look, to be fair, Texas started playing better against Oklahoma State. They would do this weird thing where they win on the road and lose at home, but it felt like the Gundy thing had been figured out a little bit.
Yeah.
Versus what had been happening earlier in the decade, obviously up until this year. It's just at the very end of the Big 12, the narratives have changed so that there aren't just a Big 2. But Texas keeps talking about itself as a Big 2, and there's really not been a Big 2. So I don't know. No, I don't think Texas, there is an if not when, I think, discussion that exists, but it's weirdly, because with Sam, it was Oklahoma's got turnover, and you've got this potentially all-time great quarterback who's a senior. If not now, when? Well, if you're Texas with Quinn Ewers, you'd probably say next year. Mm-hmm. If not now, next year. And if it's not next year, what the hell? You know what I mean? I think you look at Quinn Ewers and you think next year's the year with Quinn Ewers. But in saying that, does that mean you're definitely 3rd or 4th or worse in the Big 12? And the question that we won't get an answer from, I don't think, is what is a record that defines success at Texas this year? If Texas goes 8-4, that probably means they go 6-3 in the Big 12.
Sure.
right? Because we're going to count Alabama as a loss.
Mm-hmm.
So 8-4, 6-3 in the Big 12. That sounds pretty realistic, but that might get you Arch Manning, and maybe that just makes everybody super excited. But it feels like not good enough. That feels like the bare minimum of what Texas should be doing. That feels like they've lost probably all the games they should lose. They win the games they're supposed to win. What are you as a Texas football program if you get to the part where you beat Kansas, you get bowl eligible, but what does it mean to just be in the middle of bad and good?
Yeah,
and
to be what Oklahoma State is usually for most years, right? In that eight-ish to maybe 10, if all goes well, range, like good, but that with the occasional run, that's a tough one because that's
even better than that's better than what Texas has been doing.
Well, yeah, since I've been into 2014, I've covered 3 5 and 7 seasons.
Yeah,
3 non-bowl eligible seasons. Like it's pretty freaking hard to do, but yet Texas has done it 3 times, and that's not the standard of what Texas fans expect. Isn't 7-5, 8-4? That Texas fans.
This team probably should have been like 7-5, like 5-7 is. They lost all their coin flips. You win a couple of coin flips, you finish 7-5. To me, that's not much different because it's ultimately not accomplishing the thing that you want to accomplish. And I think Texas has to be very careful to not turn itself into a program. Look, Texas fans are happy right now because of Quinn Ewers. They don't get Quinn Ewers in the transfer market. This is not a happy fan base right now. And it remains to be seen just how much of the recruiting that they finished with, they still would have finished with. If Texas finds a way to sign Arch Manning next year, it feels like Texas fans will look at whatever was accomplished and say, well, we got Arch, so that's good enough. Let's be happy. Feels like we're watching the standards of Texas drop a little bit in front of our very eyes, that in the name of we can't fire another coach, and in the name of recruiting and having quarterbacks, that substandard seasons just come with the territory. And that feels new to me. I don't know, because I think there are Texas fans Anwar who are saying 8-4 is a good year. That's not a sentence I have heard in the 25 plus years I've been covering Texas football professionally. Never have heard that. Mm-hmm. That it's being said coming into this year.
Ketch, you told me that there was a time where Mack would go on the tours after a 10-win season, and people were just not happy at all because it was only 10.
Oh my God. I wish I could take you in the hot tub time machine back to 2003. And at that point, Mack had been at Texas for 5 seasons. They'd probably won 50 games. They beat Nick Saban in a bowl game. Right before Nick Saban won a national championship at LSU, they weren't beating Oklahoma, but they were beating everybody else. They were beating everybody else's brains in. They were beating A&M. In 2003, Mack had won 4 straight over Texas A&M. Owned them. And Texas fans weren't happy. And, maybe the greatest legacy that Mack Brown will ever create was that at his worst is better than anything else these Texas fans the thing they nitpicked him over is better than anything they've ever tasted, really.
Yeah.
Going back to the 70s, you'd have to go back to Fred Akers' best seasons. I don't know. I think the moral of this video for me, though, is the Big 12 is going to be good next year. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we have been talking bad about the Big 12 for most seasons that you've been here. That if Texas can beat Oklahoma, a yellow brick road exists to, you know, a destiny that you dream of. And we spent a lot of time last year talking about, does Iowa State even belong in that conversation? What does it mean to have a bazillion starters come back? But they had never won anything before. Baylor and Oklahoma State did something last year. They got big time street cred. And now, you know, you have to factor them into the conversation in a way that we just haven't done for a while. And I just don't know that if you finish fourth in the Big 12 this year, Anwar, for me, even at 8-4, is a bit of a disaster, because it means you probably finish behind a Brent Venables first year in Oklahoma Sooners team that we've described as super vulnerable. I think the if not now when piece isn't about beating or winning the Big 12. It's about finishing over Oklahoma. You can't let the new coach jump in front of you in line if you're Steve Sarkisian and you're in your second year.